Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's June 2020, and you're listening to episode 188, which is a conversation about generations in community in the Christian church and the meme, "Okay, Boomer." On this episode, I'm joined by journal author Kyle Keating, who serves as dean and teaches history, theology, and apologetics at Providence Classical Christian Academy in St. Louis, Missouri. He has written for Christ in Pop Culture and Mere Orthodoxy websites and speaks on a variety of topics related to ethics, apologetics, and the relationship between Christianity and culture. Kyle has written a Postmodern Realities article in our print issue, volume 43, number 1, and his article is entitled, "Okay, Boomer, Time to Declare a Truce in the Generational Wars," and you can read it if you're a subscriber to the Christian Research Journal. Kyle, it's good to have you on.
Melanie, great to be back with you again.
Well, it seems like so long ago, a little bit on this topic, because we've had just a lot of things happening in the news, including the pandemic that we've been dealing with worldwide. But a while back in the fall, last year in 2019, there was this big meme going around, and it was everywhere, and it kind of just said, "Okay, Boomer." And first of all, probably for some of our audience, you're going to have to describe what a meme is, and then just that whole phrase, "Okay, Boomer," what made it go viral? Viral meaning it was just everywhere. People used it to, make comments on anything that you saw on social media. People just put a meme up there that said, "Okay, Boomer." So why don't you just kind of fill us in a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, it is true about the news cycle of our age that things that happened in fall 2019 feel like they happened 5 years ago or something like that. But here we are. So yeah, when we think about what a meme is, it essentially is some sort of usually image-based sort of snapshot, often with sort of text overlaid, and it's meant to, essentially convey this short, pithy message, usually with some element of satire, sarcasm. And what makes it a meme is essentially that it's meant to sort of be spread around and can apply to any number of circumstances or situations. And that's sort of why they are in a lot of ways built to go viral, all right? Built to be shared and distributed across the internet, built to be used in any variety number of platforms and that sort of thing. And the "Okay, Boomer" meme originally, at least as far as my research could tell, came out of the social media platform TikTok, which hosts fairly short videos. And the video is a video of an older white-haired man talking about sort of the ills of the younger generation. And then in response, we see this younger millennial or maybe even younger aged person just holding up a notebook with the words "Okay, Boomer" on it. And the idea is, that this is this pithy and dismissive way of essentially, ignoring or rejecting the lecturing of the older generation. And it really did spread in a lot of ways. It was used as a retort by lots of folks in younger generations anytime they encountered someone of an older generation that was making an argument they disagreed with. And then it was even used in real life, in sort of actual real life dialogue. And, one of the examples of this was in New Zealand's parliament. A younger member of parliament responded to criticisms of another member of parliament who was older than her by saying, "Okay, Boomer." And that's when a meme has really made it big, I suppose, is that it's being used in those sort of everyday circumstances as well.
So do you think that memes like this, because basically "Okay, Boomer" is fairly snarky, especially when used by younger generations. I mean, even some generations that I've seen it used by some Gen X people, if they were trying to be, snarky about something, they just put up "Okay, Boomer" as a reply on social media. So do you think memes like this reflect any kind of escalation of intergenerational conflict, between Gen Z and boomers, their grandparents or great grandparents? Or is this something that has been around for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, intergenerational conflict has been around as long as there have been various generations, right? Every human civilization and society and person goes through this cycle of youth, middle age, and old age. And each of those periods of life, you have a sort of certain perspective on the world. And that perspective, of course, changes when you're 15 versus when you're 35 or 40 versus when you're 60, 65. You have a different perspective on life because of all the experiences you've had and the time in which you've lived. And so, because of that, conflict is always going to exist between generations because generations have had different experiences. They've been born into different times and places, and their different experiences of the world mean that they're not always going to agree or see eye to eye. So, in one sense, I think it's always been around. But I do think, in another sense, things have escalated because there are kind of two reasons here. One, I think that technology makes time seem to move faster. And so, even as technology has sort of an innovation has grown in exponential ways, I think the net result is that older generations are more inclined to feel even more alienated in the world that they live in because it feels so different from the world that they grew up in. That's, again, always been somewhat true, but because of technology and innovation, the world of today feels really different than the world of 40 years ago, before there was an internet, before computers were ubiquitous, before social media and smartphones were a thing. And so, I think that technology has really made time move faster and made the difference between generations more stark. And then I think the other thing is that younger generations have more readily accessible resources, namely the internet. And so they feel like they don't need the wisdom of older generations as much. When you think about in previous generations, in previous eras, the knowledge of the elders, of people who were older than you, that information was necessary in order to grow as a human being, to know how to survive all these basic things in life. And now you can Google most of those things. And so the internet in some ways is all of that knowledge of the previous generations, but it's depersonalized and it feels very different, I think.
To what extent do you think that social media has played a role in exacerbating any kind of conflict between generations? I think one thing is that some of the older generations, especially the specific meme, okay, boomer, if you're talking about boomer generation and older, they don't really use social media the way younger people do as a primary form of communication. And then also, I think just like you were saying, things have changed in terms of, with technology the way that it is now. It's not like we used to have much more community life, if you think about 100 years ago, where you would interact with older generations. And now it seems that, well, you might see older people at church, but they might not be people you're related to because they live in, 500 miles away or something like that. It's not the same kind of small town community that there used to be where you'd see certain generations. I know for me, even though I'm a Gen Xer, at my church, it's quite large. We used to be divided up into age and stage. And honestly, I didn't have any opportunity to know older people than myself because I was with parents of middle school and high school kids. So how has, social media kind of increased this conflict, if any, between the generations?
Yeah, I mean, so in one sense, I think you're right that social media is used differently by different generations and different platforms are utilized by different age demographics and things like that. I mean, this is a really sort of well-known reality that the older generations are more inclined to use social media platforms like Facebook, and younger generations are more inclined to use platforms like Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok. And I'm sure there will be newer and more hip ones that I'm not even aware of that younger generations are utilizing. And so that does create a sense of, different generations aren't even utilizing social media in the same ways or the same platforms. The other reality is that social media pretty much exacerbates any sort of cultural conflict that we have because it's a platform, by and large, that encourages and rewards, to use a sort of colloquial term, dunking on people to the cheers of all of your fans or your followers, right? And so there's something about the platform of social media itself that actually encourages the sort of conflict, and especially the dismissive responses in conflict that memes are so good at. Um, and so the OK Boomer meme kind of checks all these boxes. It's really easy to do. It's not an actual argument. It doesn't really require engaging your opponent's perspectives. You can just sort of cynically dismiss them. And then it's likely to go viral and get fan approval. And that's kind of like the social media trifecta right there. It's easy. It doesn't have to be an argument, and it's likely to go viral. And I think, because of that, a meme like OK Boomer is really inclined to exacerbate or increase the amount of intergenerational conflict that's already naturally there.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Kyle Keating, who has written a Postmodern Realities column article in the 43 #1 issue of the print edition of the Christian Research Journal. And his article is called OK Boomer, Time to Declare a Truce in the Generational Wars. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the journal so that you can read Kyle's article. You can do that by going online to our website, equip.org. If a journal subscription is not in your budget right now, you can help us keep this podcast free by giving us a tip of $3, $5, or whatever is in your budget. And to tip us for our content, you can do that easily at equip.org. Go to equip.org, go to magazine at the drop-down menu. You can select Postmodern Realities Podcast. There you can find the landing page for this episode, and you can go to that, or actually any landing page there under Postmodern Realities, and you can find the link where you could give us a tip. But even better yet, we'd like to ask you to rate and review our podcast. Find us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. If you go to Apple Podcasts, just search for Postmodern Realities and we'll pop up. Please give us a starred review, or if you have a few minutes, just jot down a few thoughts about why you enjoy listening to this podcast and give us a written review. And thank you for your support. In the article that you wrote for us, that's in the current issue of the Christian Research Journal, the print issue, you talk about 3 core elements of modern American culture: expressive individualism, radical autonomy, and relentless progress. So what do you mean by each of those elements?
Sure. So I think none of these observations are my own. These are, from hearing from others, but a lot of these are also quite self-evident. So expressive individualism is essentially this idea that I find out and discover who I am by looking within myself. And then as I look within myself, I see what is it that I desire most, and then I live that out in the world. And so I find my identity primarily by internally, looking within, and then the authentic life is living out whatever it is that I desire. So that's expressive individualism. Radical autonomy is the idea that we are that we have this freedom from any sort of authority that might try and regulate us in ways that we might deem oppressive. And so this means that we have independence from all sorts of authorities, our parents, from the government, right? This is part of our American sense of freedom, is that nobody should be able to tell us what to do. And that's this element of radical autonomy. And then finally, relentless progress is, this notion within our culture that to put it in its most simple terms, new equals good, right? That staying young, whatever the newest tech fad is, being up to date on whatever the recent memes are on the internet, or whatever the most recent innovation is, right? New is good. And the more you can be up on what's new, the better, because anything that's new must be taking us forward in some sort of positive direction. And that's the idea of relentless progress.
So how do each of these elements that you just described for us of American culture impact intergenerational conflict?
Yeah, so like with expressive individualism, if I can only find out who I am by looking within myself, then nobody else can tell me who I am, right? And so what that means is those who've gone before me, my parents, their parents, uh, other members of my church that are from previous generations that might be able to speak into my life and say, uh, share wisdom and impart wisdom about these profound identity questions that younger people are asking. Expressive individualism essentially says those are not voices that you should listen to. Those are voices that are ultimately trying to control whatever answer it is that you want to come up with, and that the only way to be purely authentic is to ignore those voices and to look within. And so the net result then is that voices that you might have in other times and places have been inclined to listen to, you're actually inclined to reject. And it's similar with radical autonomy, right? That we have independence, that we long for this sort of independence from our parents, and there's a healthy sense of that. That's the non-radical autonomy, right? The sense of, when you grow up into maturity, part of growing in age is that you go from dependent to independent, and then part of the age curve is that you actually shift back towards dependence at the end of your life as well. But radical autonomy argues that independence itself, in and of itself, is a virtue, and that the goal is to have complete independence from other authorities, and especially those who might want to tell us what to do. And then the last part, relentless progress, essentially inclines us to view older generations as enemies of progress, because they're out of touch. They're out of touch technologically. They're out of touch politically. They might be out of touch socially. They might even be out of touch spiritually, right? I mean, think about the reality that lots of churches have two different services for different generations. And one of the reasons for that is because there's this sentiment among each generation, among the younger generation, that the older generation is out of touch spiritually. And then, of course, the older generation that has its own sort of potentially dismissive reaction to the younger generation. And so each of these elements, individualism, autonomy, progress, these are part and parcel of what of American culture, and they all gear Americans in general to one, a dismissive attitude towards those older than them, and two, they create an environment that is ripe for intergenerational conflict.
So, what particularly can Christians do to critique these particular cultural elements that you've talked about, especially as they impact our view of other generations? And then, specifically, how can Christian parents, as they disciple their kids, and I know you work at a school with students, how can they really be aware of it? Because sometimes parents themselves, if they're dismissive of views of other generations, that can impact how our kids perceive that they should regard other generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think the basic starting point is actually looking at ourselves and saying, hey, in what ways do I embody each of these values? In what ways have I swam in the waters of our culture so much that expressive individualism and autonomy and relentless progress, that these are, it's hard to even recognize when those are values that we're appropriating in our own hearts and lives. And so there is a real element that the first step is kind of pausing and asking some questions to say, hey, where have I adopted some of these values within my own life? Because if I'm going to go, to use the example of working with students, if I'm going to go to students and say, hey, you shouldn't be concerned with relentless progress, then I have to have in some way in my own life come to terms with that and modeled a willingness to be okay with being old-fashioned in certain contexts, or not feeling bound by the tyranny of whatever's next. And so I think that is a real part of it, is, each one of us has to sort of do that self-assessment. And then part of that self-assessment for Christians is to then reevaluate these values of individualism, autonomy, progress, over against what the Bible teaches, and to say, where does the Bible affirm elements of individualism or autonomy or even progress, and where does it actually offer, in some ways, a pretty sharp critique of some of these elements of our own culture. And I think when you juxtapose our own culture's values, these three values that our culture has with the Bible, we see really different pictures of what communities are supposed to look like and the roles that different generations are supposed to play within those communities.
So, what does the Bible specifically have to say about intergenerational conflict and intergenerational relationships? I don't know that as Christians we always think about that, although the Bible does mention it frequently about what that's like, because, like you talked about, this expressive individualism, I think American Christianity can have this very the most important thing is my relationship with God and less about horizontal interaction with others.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the Bible is that this element of intergenerational community is just baked into the entire story. And so if you read the Bible, you end up with this vision of community that's really quite different. And instead of like something like expressive individualism, instead you have something that is intergenerational. And instead of radical autonomy, you have something that's a community that's deeply interdependent. And then instead of relentless progress, you have a community that's committed to remembering the past. And so that's, these three elements, this intergenerational, interdependent, and remembering community. That's the picture of God's people in the Old Testament, and it's the picture of God's people in the New Testament as they're reconstituted in the church. It's still intergenerational, it's still interdependent, and it's still rooted in one of its core acts of worship is actually remembrance of who God is and what he's done. And we get into, there are dozens of places in the Bible that we could look to see how this plays out. The Old Testament has dozens upon dozens of examples of God and the leaders of God's people exhorting God's people to remember who the Lord is, remember what he's done for you. And that part of the reason that intergenerational community is so important in the Old Testament is it's the job of the older generation of Israelites to teach and remind and help the younger generations to remember what it is that's happened in the past. And so the older generation is to teach the younger generation about their own failings and idolatry so that the younger generation doesn't repeat them. The older generation is supposed to remind the younger generation of Israelites about God's deliverance from the hands of Pharaoh and the crossing of the Red Sea and the Exodus, because that younger generation didn't experience it firsthand. And if it's not passed down from that older generation, they won't know it. And so that's one of the places you see in the Old Testament. Obviously, within the 10 Commandments, the commandment to honor your father and mother is a core part of the Old Testament law and the shape of Israel's community. And I mean, the same is true in the New Testament as well. You could look at this passage in Titus 2. That's sort of one of the characteristic passages that encompasses the different generations that are in, the church. And Paul is writing to Titus, and he says this, this is Titus 2. He says, older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their own husbands, that the word of the Lord may not be reviled. Likewise, urge the younger men to be self-controlled. So what's interesting here is in Paul's exhortation to Titus, there are these instructions for all the various generations, but there's an interchange that's supposed to be going on between these generations. So the older generations are supposed to love the younger generations, seeking to teach and model the best of what they've learned, instead of resenting the younger generation that's going to eventually replace them. And then similarly, the younger generation is called to love older generations by actually submitting to their wisdom and subduing their pride. And these are two things that are incredibly countercultural in our moment. The idea that younger generations are supposed to submit to the wisdom of their elders, subduing our own pride and ambition, and recognizing that younger generations don't have it all figured out, that we actually have something to learn from those who are older than us. And so the Bible's picture of community is always intergenerational. It's always interdependent. You can't do it on your own. It's not just you and Jesus, and it's a remembering community. It's not just focused on what's coming in the future, but it's rooted in this reality of what's happened in the past and this need to constantly go back and remember what it is that the Lord has done in the past.
In the context of this particular article, you are honing in on elements of American culture, so church in the West. And one thing about church in America, in the last, 30 years or 40 years since the birth of the megachurch and so forth, and you talked about different kinds of services, is that the Christian church, by and large, two things that they think about. One is, how do we make our services and our ministries and outreaches, quote unquote, relevant and authentic to the younger generation? And at first, it was so much of a focus on the millennial generation, but you're writing in our Postmodern Realities column, which is we wanted millennial writers, but some of the millennials are now almost 40. And so now we're thinking about Gen Z, whatever you want to call them, who are the kids that are, in high school, like the age of my youngest son in high school and the age of my just graduated a year ago college son. So that even younger than the millennials, right? So what role does the church have to play in addressing this? Because they've seen so many young people leave the church because, just, I don't know if it's social media or just issues that younger people have, but they don't think that Christianity is relevant. And so they are leaving the church. And so there's this kind of movement to how can we get younger people back or make our churches more hip or reach them. So how does the church address this when they feel like they're facing this kind of tension? There's, on the one hand, there's older people in their church, but how do they, minister to the younger people or seem like that they have something to offer for the younger generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a paradox here, right? There's this sense of, hey, lots of folks from younger generations seem to be leaving the church. And so then there's this well-intentioned desire to say, hey, what things can we change to cater to that demographic so that they'll enjoy being at church more, or it'll connect better with them, or that sort of thing. And that's where you get this strong emphasis on relevance at the expense of tradition, or relevance at the expense of something that's intergenerational. And so you end up with all these moves that churches make in an attempt to be missional, an attempt to reach the millennial or even younger than millennial demographic. And I think that's a point to make here, is that we talk a lot about, the millennial boomer conflict. But a lot of the things that we attribute to millennials are that younger generation that's emerged after the millennials as well. And so I think that's an important piece to note. But yeah, so as a church, we've often separated our worship services so that the music style could accommodate the younger and the older generation in their own sort of separate spaces. Or you see this in small groups, right, that are formed this way, or the emphasis on college ministries or high school ministries that are separate from the rest of the body, that are sort of demographically targeted at this particular age range. And so I suppose it's important at this point for me to make clear I'm not against any and all demographically targeted ministry. There are good reasons to do it in context. I think the thing that I want to communicate is that there's a real danger if you do targeted demographic ministry apart from any sort of connection to a whole church community that's actually intergenerational, that's actually rooted in something more than, hey, we're trying to appear hip and cool and draw in as many young people as we can. Because the problem with that is you're always going to have to be changing and developing to become more hip and more cool. And it ends up cultivating a really superficial faith among younger people. And then it's a faith that's less likely to withstand the trials and difficulties of life. And so that's the irony, is that, or the paradox here, is that churches that really focus on segregating generations so that they can really target young people and make church hip and cool for them actually are building often faith that is superficial and less likely to last in the long run. And so sometimes it's actually the seemingly more boring but more deeply rooted faith that comes from churches that are committed to intergenerational worship that actually is likely to stick with younger generations. And there is this reality too that there's a number of statistics that suggest that really the most significant factor in determining whether younger people stay within the church or not is what their experience was like at home, right? In that first intergenerational community they were ever a part of. if they were discipled and taught the scriptures at home, if they lived in a home that modeled the gospel, they're far more likely to remain in the church after they leave the home. And so that's one of the, I think that's one of the most persuasive arguments for intergenerational worship is that really pragmatic argument that kids are more likely to stay in the church when they've been trained and discipled in good intergenerational community, both at home and in the church.
Years ago, sociologist Christian Smith wrote this really well-known book called Soul Searching. It was about like the religious beliefs of American teenagers in specific, and how they were really not particularly religious, no matter what religion they were practicing, but they had this kind of like moral deism that they believed in, right? And the whole conclusion of his book, one of his conclusions, was that the thing that would help the kids the most to understand their faith, whether it was Christianity or some other religion, was that they needed to be involved in life in their religious community and be mentored by somebody older. So I thought that was really interesting. So what challenges do you think, given that, sociological secular research has shown that intergenerational mentorship makes such a difference in the lives of, and I'm sure even though this was a long time ago, decades or more than a decade ago where he did this research, it's still probably true today. So what other challenges has the church faced as they've tried to address intergenerational conflict and then be a bridge maybe between different generations through their ministries and their outreaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I'd highlight here is that one of the reasons why churches move towards forms of, targeted demographic ministries or generational separation in our ministries is because it does two things. One, it's easier because it lets you sort of isolate variables and address particular people in their particular stage of life and that sort of thing. And any preacher or teacher knows the difficulty of trying to speak to a whole room when the whole room encompasses this wide, vast array of experiences, because you want to say this one thing to this segment of people over here, and you want to say this different thing over here. Talk about this with, teaching in the classroom. Sometimes you're trying to talk to a whole classroom and you have students in the room that are perfectionists. And then you have other students in the room that are inclined to do as little work as possible to get by. And so to some of them, you want to say, hey, you really got to get it in gear and really focus and put the work in for this. But if you say that and you're trying to say that to the apathetic demographic, the problem is your perfectionists are hearing that too. And they're thinking, oh man, I got to work harder. Right. And so that's the difficulty in trying to speak to two audiences at once. And that's not a new difficulty, but that's one of the reasons why we're so inclined to separate out by generation, is it lets us target communication. And then it makes people happy, right? Like if younger people want music that's more upbeat and anthemic and sounds more like Coldplay or something like that, you can give them that. And then if the older generation prefers the timeless hymns and flipping open the hymn book, you can give them that, right? And then everybody's happy. And so I think that's, one of the reasons the church has faced challenges in building intergenerational ministry is it's both easier and it makes people happy to separate them out. And it's actually far more uncomfortable to engage in the hard work of bringing different generations together for intergenerational worship. I actually think, in some ways this mirrors not exactly, and there's a lot of disanalogy here as well. But I think there are some similarities to the elements of racial reconciliation within the church, and why is the church so inclined to be segregated by race? And I think it's sometimes because it's easier and it requires it's less uncomfortable. It's more comfortable. And doing the hard work of getting really, people with different stories and different experiences together in the same room, worshiping the same God, is actually often uncomfortable and difficult. And I think that's true with respect to, racial segregation. But I think it's also true with respect to intergenerational differences and getting different generations into the same room together as well.
So, what are some practical ways that church congregations can create what you call in your article a place of permanent ceasefire for generational conflict?
Yeah, the story that comes to mind here for me, I teach history, European history, and in the Great War, World War One, as the first Christmas comes around in 1914, there's this truce that happens on the Western Front between the two sides, and it's during this truce that there are the trenches built up on either side, and then there's this land in the middle called No Man's Land, where if you were to run out there, you're likely to get shot by machine gun fire, and so it's really dangerous to go up there. And the two sides, in large, areas of the front, call a truce on Christmas, and they end up meeting each other across the trenches in no man's land, and playing soccer together and fellowshipping and whatnot. And then the truce ends and the war resumes, and it goes on for 4 more, really bloody years. But the idea, I love the vision of that truce, because it is this, in the middle of the conflict, it recognizes that there's this risk and this discomfort that comes from getting up out of your trench and going and connecting with the other side of the conflict. And I think the church is essentially the place where that is the place that's best equipped for that to happen, because the Bible's vision of community is what we've talked about. It's intergenerational, it's interdependent, it's based on remembering. And so there's this whole biblical theological basis for all of us to be together. We're united in one faith, one baptism, one Savior. And so that's the foundation of the unity that different generations have when they come together in the church. But you asked about practical ways. I've talked all in the abstract, practical ways. I mean, I've mentioned this, I've alluded to this a couple different times, and we've talked about it here and there, but intergenerational worship, I think, is huge. I think getting it so that you have your 5 and 6 year olds singing songs alongside your 70 and 80 year olds in church is really important. And it does a lot of things that we don't necessarily even recognize in the moment. It sends a lot of messages. It communicates a lot of theological truth merely by doing that, by being together. It reminds me of I was traveling in Asia for missions some years ago, and the particular city I was traveling in had this big open public square, and on certain nights of the week, members of the community, it was a fairly large city, but members of the community would just come out and gather in the square, and they'd dance together. And it wasn't a organized dance class that you had to register for. It wasn't, this one-off event. It was this really regular practice of members of the community coming out. And I remember just watching one day as there was this sort of choreographed line dance that the whole community seemed to know. And there was this moment where I was looking, and in the line was this girl who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, and she was doing this choreographed dance right next to this elderly Asian man who had to be in his 70s, and they were just dancing right next to each other. And it didn't seem that they knew each other. I wouldn't have known for sure, but that whole community was out there participating in that together. And so I think that's something that's actually probably far more common in certain Eastern cultures than it is in Western cultures. And I that moment made me think, yeah, that's actually the kind of thing the church ought to be doing, is having these choreographed moments of worship where people who are from really different generations are singing the same songs, are praying the same prayers, are reciting the same creeds, because it speaks so much truth simply by existing that way. It reminds us that the faith is not dependent on the day or the age, that it's the faith that's been delivered to us from generations to generations, So I think intergenerational worship is the biggest thing I'd highlight there, that literally on the Lord's Day, having members from all generations, and this can be complicated, right? Because it means having young kids in service where they're likely to disrupt the service, right? Where they're likely to disturb other parishioners because they're kids, or having babies or whatever in the service. And so we're inclined to say, oh, we need to have nursery, we need to have children's church, we need to have all those things. And I think there can be practical places for those. But I think we often start by thinking about how can we get kids out of church, instead of thinking about starting with how can we think about keeping our whole community together for as much of that worship service as we can. And we might have to make some practical concessions here and there, but that intergenerational worship as a priority, I think it makes a big difference in the life of churches and in the way that faith, really is rooted more deeply in the lives of the people within that community. I suppose the second thing, and we talked about this, you'd mentioned this, the idea of mentoring or discipling relationships is huge. Some of the most profound relationships in my own life have been with men who are a generation older than me, who took time when I was in high school and in college to invest in my life. And so much of the reason for why I am where I am today is because of those men who were, 5, 10, 15 years ahead of me in life, and who used that wisdom and knowledge to build into me. And I think that that's a huge thing. And it's a thing that's in a lot of ways can be hard to do, because as a younger person, it's not always easy to admit that you want help from somebody who's older. And as an older person, there's always this risk of like, if I put myself out there, is there really, do people really want that sort of mentoring or discipleship? But I think the more that that's actually happening within a church, I think that's a huge indicator of the health of a church. Are the elders of the church and the men and women of the church who have the wisdom and experience, the hard-won wisdom and experience of a life of faith, are they building into the younger generation? And I think that's a huge barometer of the health of a congregation.
So you wrote this article for us, and we're recording this podcast episode in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the United States, that's had a disproportionately high impact. There's been a lot of people, seniors in particular, that have been impacted by this disease, people over 70 years old. So, especially in nursing homes. So what has the pandemic revealed about our attitudes towards the elderly generation? Because I've seen some comments on social media, of course, about people saying, well, that's okay, they're old anyway, so, it was their time to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I started writing and thinking about these questions before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and suddenly these questions about how do we relate to elderly generations came to the fore in ways that it doesn't often, right? One of the things about our culture is that we rarely do think about the elderly, and yet this pandemic comes and makes us actually think about it. And one of the things it revealed was some stuff that was not so great, right? That we often value our own lives or our own comfort over the lives of others. And I think that's especially true when it's at what I'll call a data-driven distance. So when it's a demographic of old people might be more susceptible, we feel much more inclined to be like, well, maybe that's a risk that we're willing to take, or, comorbidity, and there are other things that could cause someone who's elderly to die, and all these pieces. But when we start to think about our own relationships, our own grandparents, perhaps our own parents who are in older generations who are at high risk for contracting the COVID disease, that's when we start to really, I think, wrestle with, oh, yeah, like I need to have a measure of self-awareness and be willing to make changes in my own life for the sake of others, even if it's really uncomfortable. Now, there's all sorts of debate about how many changes needed to have been made and how many restrictions were appropriate versus weren't. And that's really not this conversation. But I think we've seen both the good and the bad actually revealed by the pandemic. The bad being, hey, there actually is a sort of inherent selfishness that often comes with youth. And that can often be the default posture of young people as well. If it's not going to affect me, then I'm not going to worry about it. But I think we've also seen some of the good, which has been actually a willingness among the vast majority of people to make radical changes to their daily life, sometimes at great cost to themselves, for the sake of others, even though they're not the ones who are most likely to have dangerous complications from the illness. And I suppose the one other thing that the pandemic has done is it's actually forced us to do a little bit of remembering. There's been this sense of like, oh yeah, it's been a really long time since we had a global pandemic, probably since the Spanish flu of the early 20th century. And so there's this, hey, we kind of need to remember what happened back then. What did people do? How did they deal with it back then? And there's been this inclination to go back and remember. And that's actually part of the value of intergenerational community, is that those sort of stories and experiences are passed down and shared so that we know how to deal with and confront the challenges of our own day and our own moment.
So How might this pandemic, this time, offer churches an opportunity to practically engage in cross-generational ministry? Like, it's kind of brought out, like you said, some things that haven't been good as we've looked about our attitudes towards maybe some of the older generations, the boomers and older. But what are ways in which it could be a good thing that helps us to better engage in cross-generational ministry?
Yeah, I mean, so, as we're recording this, we're sort of at this stage of the pandemic where lots of the lockdowns are starting to be eased, and a lot of the restrictions are being eased. But there was certainly that stretch in April and May where stay-at-home orders were in place and where it was a really, seemingly high-risk activity for the elderly to do simple things like go shop and get groceries and run basic errands. And so there were a number of, I saw even within Christian communities in and around me, where churches or even among non-Christians, a willingness to say, hey, if there's an elderly neighbor that needs someone else to run the errand for them, we're willing to do that. Churches that were doing that for elderly members of their own communities, they were making sure that their groceries got delivered to them. And so those were sort of ways in which younger generations that were maybe not as at high risk were actually serving those who were at higher risk in really tangible ways. And I think the other thing that it offered, and probably still does offer an opportunity to do, is reach out and make connections digitally. One of the interesting things is when you're in a stay-at-home order, everybody is the same distance away in the sense of to communicate with them, right? If you're going to communicate with someone, you're going to do it over the internet or over the phone if you're at home. And that means that the person that lives 150 miles away is just as close to you as the person that lives 5 miles away, because you're going to communicate with them in the same way. And so I know in my own life and with me and my wife, we ended up actually connecting with friends at a distance far more regularly than we did before the pandemic. And we also had more time on our hands because we were stuck at home. But I think one of the ways that this can happen is by actually reaching out and making connections digitally, especially with folks that are in nursing homes, especially given the restrictions that have been, and in a lot of cases continue to be in place, preventing visitors from nursing homes. There's already the deep reality of loneliness in those sort of contexts. And so I think actually going and taking the initiative to say, hey, I'm gonna call my grandparents, I'm gonna FaceTime them, I'm gonna reach out to them. I think that's a pretty practical way that that Christians can care for others, especially across the generational divide at this moment in history.
I do think, though, you were just mentioning churches opening up. I've run into some older folks from my church just out and about, at stores and stuff, and they're still wanting to worship. They don't feel it's totally safe for them if they have health issues. So there's still probably opportunities for people to help some of the older generation folks out because they're not ready to return to church just yet, and they might still be spending more of their time at home. So people should look for those opportunities in their congregations. Well, finally, I want to end with some fun questions for Kyle. And so I've been asking a few quarantine-related ones lately. So during the shelter in place, was your family eating more comfort food? Were you eating more healthy food, or were you doing some takeout to help local restaurants survive the pandemic when they were closed?
So we had a day of the week that was designated for takeout. And so we did take out of some of our favorite restaurants right around us that were still doing carry out. It was pretty much every Friday evening we would do that. So that was always a highlight of the week. And then otherwise, I think we went on the roller coaster of, we need some comfort food to deal with quarantine. And then after you've done that a while, you're like, I need some health food to balance it out. And you know how that cycle goes.
So what were the easiest things to adjust to while you're being quarantined and some of the more challenging things? What was something that was really challenging for you?
Yeah, so I mean, as my primary job and role, I'm a teacher, and I teach, history and theology to high school students, and shifting on a dime from small in-person classes around a table to education over the internet was not an easy thing, and it wasn't a desirable thing for us in our school context. And so we really value the in-person, face-to-face, small class context. And so that was difficult to adjust to, and we're eager to be back to normal with respect to that when the fall rolls around, for sure.
And so you just mentioned that you were a teacher. Do you have a really brief word of encouragement for students as they adjust to, uncertainty, I guess, for seniors if they graduated, like what's college going to look like in the fall, or, some things that we're used to doing in the warp and woof of school might be different in the fall. So is there anything that you can say for students who kind of feel like this year ended really oddly for them?
Yeah, I mean, it did end oddly for them, and I think one of the things that I would say is that it's okay to grieve the things that were lost because of that, grieve the experiences and things that they would have had expectations to be able to do that they weren't. I don't think that you have to stuff it down and say, well, it's okay. It needed to be done. I think it's okay to grieve that, but also to know that that even in the midst of those things that are lost, that God is always in the business of redeeming things that are lost and broken. And he's going to do that with this season. He's going to do that with this particular generation of folks, this particular senior class that's looking and, recognizes that their senior class is going to be different than any class that came before and probably any class that came after because of their experiences. But there are probably going to be some good things that came out of that for them that they'll have by virtue of, even the losses, even the difficulty of shifting online. In a lot of ways, when you lose things that you take for granted, you become far more grateful for the things that you have. I think most of us took for granted lots of experiences that we got to have. And some of these students that have lost those experiences are probably far more likely to be grateful for the good experiences that they've had in their high school and college years, even in the midst of what they've lost.
I think the big question is, when we had that toilet paper shortage at your house, do you guys hang toilet paper over or under?
We are over for sure.
Well, thanks, Kyle, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thanks for having me, Melanie. It was a pleasure as always.
You've been listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is journal author Kyle A. Keating, who has written a Postmodern Realities article in that column in the new print edition of the journal, which is volume 43, number 1. His article is called "Okay, Boomer, Time to Declare a Truce in the Generational Wars." We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. And please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes, and please rate and review our podcast. When you rate and review our podcast, it helps others see our content. And please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast, hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged, Hank's audio podcast. Follow Hank off the grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.